Good news for Daniel Ricciardo Formula One fans out there. After some of those comments that we saw from him after the Mexican Grand Prix, the suggestion that he was going to let Gasly drive it for the final two races, he's clarified those comments, and this weekend in Brazil he is driving for Red Bull and he will finish the season with the team. I've got Ben Anderson and Jake Boxall-Legge here to discuss what Ricciardo said, whether he really meant it, and perhaps why he's had so many troubles with Red Bull this season and what that could mean looking at his move to Renault next year, because obviously Renault currently supply Red Bull with engines. Ben, we'll start with you. The comments he made after the Mexican Grand Prix, the car's cursed, there's no point coming to the next couple of races, all that sort of stuff. Is that just racing driver anger in the heat of the moment, or in this case, was there a bit more to it?
I think there's a bit more to it in this case. The comments obviously were made in the heat of the moment, but this is a build-up of frustration through the season. Ricciardo started the season so well, he won those two races, was on top of the Red Bull team, on top of Max Verstappen. Everything's kind of unravelled as the season has gone on, and you can get yourself into a negative spiral quite easily, and especially when it's not your fault, when you're driving well and the car just lets you down. If it keeps on doing that, it's very hard to maintain the motivation, and Ricciardo clearly got to the point where a second consecutive failure in as many races just broke him, I think, and he just feels like, well, what's the point? Whatever I do, the car's going to break, so I might as well just give up, go to the beach early and come back stronger next season. The fact he felt moved to clarify his comments after Mexico on Instagram suggests that he perhaps even told the team that he wasn't going to do the final two races. Normally, a driver would make those kind of comments, not in jest, but in frustration, and then at the next race you'd see them and they would, with no adrenaline flowing and a chance to reflect, say, oh, well, just take the rough with the smooth and move on to the next race. But the fact that Ricciardo had to felt he needed to make a specific statement suggests there was a genuine desire there, perhaps, to miss the final two races.
Jake, something we've seen a lot in the Ricciardo Red Bull dynamic since he announced his move to Renault in the summer is that whenever his car fails, Christian Horner's very quick to say, oh, well, if he's got a problem with reliability, he needs to talk to his future employer, suggesting that every problem we've been seeing is Renault related. Ricciardo's had 6 mechanical failures in races this season. Interestingly, the Renault Works team, their drivers, Nico Hülkenberg and Carlos Sainz Jr., have only had 1 each in races. There are obviously other problems that occur earlier in the weekend, and we see engine changes and engine penalties as a result of those. But purely focusing on lost races because of failures, the numbers between Red Bull and the Renault Works team are quite different. Can there be any explanation for that?
Well, we know that Red Bull are a team who likes to really push the envelope with regards to car design. They're absolutely going for it when they get to a drawing board and start designing a new car. We know that Renault are a slightly different phase. They're still in a slight rebuilding phase, and therefore they're not pushing the envelope quite as much. And as Red Bull push their design hard, they're at the limit with what they can do with their cooling, what they can do with their systems, that kind of thing. And so it could be that they're working their engine to a point that it can't handle. There have been, perhaps system shutdowns as a result of overheating, for example, and Renault haven't really had so much of that problem. And it could be that they're just not as extreme on their design as Red Bull are. But again, there are 2 different teams at 2 different phases, and if Renault want to claw back a little bit of performance, they're going to have to start pushing it as well, and they might start to encounter some of the same issues.
You've also got the fact that Renault being the works team, they've designed that engine for their car. They've got more data available, more understanding about how best to get the most out of that engine, how to install it in the car absolutely perfectly. They've got a different fuel partner that they work closely with, and they have to allow dyno time for Red Bull and its different fuel partner to get on there. All these things play into a situation that isn't perfect for Red Bull, and there'll be mistakes on both sides. Sometimes Red Bull will get the calculations wrong or slightly out of sync and suffer problems. Equally, we know that the standard of Renault's supply hasn't always been up to scratch, and they've been a bit stretched supplying Red Bull as well as another customer team and their own works team, and all these things can come together to create stress and reliability problems.
Jake mentioned there that Renault may be about to enter a phase where they are going to start to push harder. If Ricciardo's got this sort of mindset at the end of this year, is there a potential concern there that if Renault are about to try and ramp things up, there's a potential natural consequence that there are going to be some failures, even if it's just early on.
Yeah, I think Ricciardo will probably enter next season with a different mindset. I mean, he has to, because he's stepping down the grid. He's going from a team that can win races in the right circumstances and fight for championships to a team that's still building back up, that is in the midfield and clearly adrift of the top teams. So he can't go in with this mindset that everything's going to be great, there's going to be no problems. He'll probably be encouraged by the fact that, as you mentioned, the Renault works cars have had fewer problems in races, and he'll probably understand that actually going to the works team, all this closer collaboration and better installations and everything else will alleviate some of his concerns and give him less potential to have reliability problems that he would have with Red Bull. I think also he will have learned a lot from 2015. You know, he when he came into Red Bull in 14, won some races. He got a bit carried away. He felt that, you know, he was ready to then win a world championship. He thought 2015 Red Bull would give him a car and Renault would give him an engine that would allow him to do that. He had a disastrous season, lots of reliability problems, quite similar to the second half of this year, and that really got to him. He sort of fell out of love with Formula 1 a little bit. He realised he needs not to set too high expectations going into a season and roll with things a bit more, take it as it comes. If he's learned his lessons from that experience, as he says he has, then he'll go into next season bearing in mind that he shouldn't set too high expectations, not expect too much from the new team. And he might also benefit just from being in a fresh environment.
Jake, where would you assess Renault's progress this season? It looks like they're going to end the year established as the Class B winner, as we call it. But at some point, they're going to have to start trying to take that next step to try and get near the top three teams. We know that the engine isn't up to scratch, and there's a lot of talk now that the Honda is either on par with the Renault or potentially going to surpass it. But aerodynamically as well, the team are going to have to take steps across the board to be worthy of a driver of Ricciardo's calibre, aren't they?
Well, it's been a bit of a strange year in that it looked like they were nailed on for a top four spot, and then Haas kind of came into play a little bit and started to challenge them. And towards the end of the season, they've been very hit or miss. And it seems that they've really pinned a lot of focus on next year. As you say, yeah, they're going to have to really start challenging the top three, or otherwise, you know, it's not going to look like a viable financial excuse for Renault to keep funding it if they're not in the fight so much. With regards to their engine, there is a little bit of convergence between, you know, we saw such a huge gap at the start of this turbo era, and there is a bit of convergence. You see Mercedes and Ferrari are now very close. Honda have really caught up to Renault, and if not, have surpassed them. And they're going to have to spend quite a lot of time over the winter getting their sums right and making sure that they're a lot closer to the front teams.
Yeah, we talk about how this is a big winter for Honda, entering a new partnership with Red Bull and the pressure that's potentially on them, but it's a big winter for Renault too, and they overestimated, I think, how much progress they would make last winter into this season. I remember Cyril Abiteboul saying that they wanted to latch on to Red Bull by the end of this season. That hasn't happened. They're nowhere near, and he's since said, "Oh, well, we've overestimated our targets. We haven't quite got there with the engine. We need to rethink, do a new design for next year." You know, that's not a team that's hitting the path of development that it intended. They're still behind, and so they need to kind of get back on track, and that puts more pressure on them, on their resources and on their ideas to try and get back on track next season and bridge that gap, because at the moment that gap is massive.